Hello and welcome to the Confident at Work podcast. Yep, you heard that right. The podcast has got a new name. So we've gone from the SU Coaching podcast to the Confident at Work podcast because let's face it, that is what the podcast is all about. So let's just do what it says on the tin and call it the Confident at Work podcast. I hope you like the new name and I hope that you will stick with us. And if you've been listening for a short time or a long time, or this is your first episode, thank you for joining us. We love to have you as part of the podcasting community. So, this week, we're talking about needing to prove yourself. So, you're in the job. Maybe you've got the promotion, you've secured the role, no one's complaining. But you have this sneaky little thought in your mind which is creating all kinds of problems. It's like a gremlin that's knocking stuff over, that's hiding and jumping out of boxes. I imagine this thought like a little gremlin, and it's creating overworking, overstressing, overthinking, overchecking. It could be creating more anxiety. It could be creating more stress. It could be creating more pressure. And that thought, that little gremlin thought that's creating all of that is, I need to prove myself. It's a thought, right? It's a thought or a belief that could be living like a little gremlin inside your mind. And when it is inside your mind, even when you don't really notice it, it can be causing all kinds of problems and issues. So let's say you're at work and you're doing your best work, you're giving your best effort, you're trying to deliver, you're trying to do good work for your clients, you're trying to be a great member of your team, you're trying to be a good leader. You could be doing that based on the love of the work that you do, or the care you have for the people around you, or your feelings about your level of professionalism and how you like to do things, right? That could be what's motivating the work that you do and the way that you show up at work. But what I sometimes find is that this little gremlin thought, I have to prove myself, is the thing that is in theory, motivating someone, or it can be motivating all different types of behavior. So I think it can be motivating overworking, overthinking, overstressing, overchecking. When that little gremlin thought, I have to prove myself, is living in my mind, it motivates all kinds of behavior, which can prove to be problematic. And you might not even know that you're thinking it. But I want you to think for a second about how you would feel if your boss told you each day when you got into work, you need to prove yourself today. How would you feel? What would you think? To me, that sounds kind of vaguely threatening. Like, you need to prove yourself, like, or else. And I wanted to share this episode about needing to prove yourself because it comes up fairly often with coaching clients. So when we look behind a behavior, let's say someone's, working incredibly long hours and they don't want to be, they don't have any boundaries and they don't know why, or they're over checking things, they're overstressed, they're over anxious. We kind of take a little look inside their mind and we like shine a torch in there and we see, okay, what's going on that's creating all of that? And sometimes what we find is this thought, this little gremlin thought, I need to prove myself. And sometimes it's conscious. So people are thinking it consciously like, well, I know I need to prove myself. But often it's unconscious. It's a thought that's kind of hiding in the back there. And I can imagine it like this little gremlin with like long arms and weird boggly eyes. And it might be just swirling around in the back of your mind. You never really chose it. You never really decided that you wanted to think like that. You never really even questioned whether or not you believed it, but it's still there running amok. And I've got a couple of examples, anonymous examples that clients kindly let me share with you on the podcast today, on the basis that all of my clients kindly always say, yeah, you can share that if it's going to help somebody else. And it always does help somebody else. So here's two examples. So I have a client who wanted to ask for help with a particular piece of work, but they couldn't. And they thought, actually, I do need support with this, but I'm going to try and battle through and do it on my own. And when we looked at that, we found the thought, that gremlin little thought, I need to prove myself. So when we explored, okay, well, is it okay in your team to ask for help with a project? And they said, yeah, it's okay. People don't mind that. Generally, people are quite supportive. They're quite helpful. Okay, so that's all right. So, would other people give you the time if you asked for it? Is that an issue? They said, no, they probably would. Yep, they probably would. They probably would give me their time. They'd lend me their expertise. Okay. Are you worried about what they would think about you? And they said, well, to be honest, people ask for help all the time. Everyone's an expert, everyone's a professional, but, that is the kind of support that people give each other in the team. It was like, okay. And the client identified that they were having this thought that they needed to prove themselves. And this is how it went in their mind. So I need to prove myself, and therefore I can't ask for any help because that's evidence that I'm not good enough at my job. And I need to prove that I am good enough at my job. So when we looked at that, and this thought was really lodged in the back of my client's mind, they did not even know that they were thinking it, and they certainly didn't know that it was having an impact on them asking for help. When we were actually able to see it and look at it, they could say, actually, do you know what? It's not true. It, I am good enough at my job, and I'll be better at it if I ask for this help. And I actually believe that everybody has to go through a learning curve, and everyone has to go through a process of, finding out new things. And the reason that we have teams is because we can get the support to do that. So for this client, because they could finally identify this little gremlin thought that was happening, and this, well, it was like an illusion that their brain had created. If I ask for help, I can't ask for help because I have to prove myself, because otherwise, I'm not good enough at my job. They could say, "Oh, do you know what? Actually, that's not even true." And off they went, ask for help, all good. Another example is another one of my lovely clients who had got a promotion. And this is not unusual with promotions, I think, but they'd got a promotion, and so they'd secured the job, and they came to me months into the job, and they said, I need to prove myself. And so they consciously thought that, they were aware of it. And I said, okay. And when we looked at it, I need to prove myself. That thought was stressing them out, was making them overwork, was making them overcheck, and it was eroding their belief in themselves. So they were thinking, I need to prove myself. I need to prove I'm good enough for this job, even though they'd already been given the job. Everybody else already thought that they were good enough to do the job. But in their mind, they still had to prove that they were good enough to do the job. Now, imagine what that does to someone's confidence when they're in a new job. Every day going in thinking, I need to prove myself today. Like, oh, what? It's a very threatening kind of a thought, isn't it? Everyone else is like, yeah, you got the promotion, you're good enough to do the job. But inside your own mind, it's like, you're not good enough to do the job. You have to prove it every single day. Very stress inducing. So, why do we sometimes think this? Why do we sometimes feel like this? I think probably what happens is we get this idea, maybe just somewhere in the back of our mind, that we need to prove something about our competence. And maybe that comes from, a fear of being judged if we're, thought to be not good enough, or we're thought to be inadequate in some way. And this could generate this thought of, I need to prove myself, I need to prove myself, I need to prove myself. Or maybe you've been in an environment in the past where you really did need to prove yourself all the time. And that can get transferred with you. But as far as coaching's concerned, like, we say that we're future focused, which means that unlike some types of therapy and some other types of helping professions, we don't go back into the past and kind of dig around to say, okay, well, what happened in your life or in your childhood that brought you to this thought today that you need to prove yourself? We don't do that. What we do is we start on wherever you are today. So we can identify this thought, I need to prove myself. And if we can identify it, let's say, on a Thursday morning. Okay, well, what does that thought look like on a Thursday morning? When you're believing that thought at work on a Thursday morning, what happens? And I had a bit of a think for this episode about what happens when we're thinking or believing I've got to prove myself or I've got something to prove. And I think it's useful to think of it from the external. So I asked you earlier, imagine what it would be like if your boss told you every day, you've got something to prove. You've got to prove yourself worthy today. You've got to prove you're good enough to do this job. I mean, for some people, that would be like, yeah, an eye of the tiger moment, like, ding, 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 like, yeah, watch me go. But for most people, and definitely for my people, that is going to stress them out, thinking that they've got to prove themselves every day. It's going to make them feel insecure. It's going to make them have increased anxiety. It's going to make them feel increased pressure. And what that does, unfortunately, in my experience, is it decreases our focus at work. It decreases our output. And it decreases our ability to do the kind of complex thinking that we need to do in our jobs. The other thing that I've seen that can happen when people are thinking, I need to prove myself, is that they just work more in order to try and prove themselves worthy or prove themselves good enough. They work more. So the problem is, I need to prove myself. And the solution that they come up with is, I'll just work loads. That'll prove it. But unfortunately, you could work 16 hours a day, and while you're still believing, I need to prove myself, it's still never going to be good enough. So this thought can kind of trap you in a cycle of overworking, and still you can't quite meet this standard of proving yourself. Because proving what, even? The other thing that might happen, and we explored this in our first example, is I might become totally self-sufficient and I might not ever ask for any support or help, even when I need it. Because we've got something to prove, right? So we can't ask someone for help. We can't, God forbid, we could tell someone that we're not sure about this, or we don't know about that, or maybe we've made a bit of a mistake with this. We've got something to prove. We can't, let the mask slip for even 1 second. So we might keep issues or challenges to ourselves and just try and power through, even when there's people there who could and would support us if we could ask. The other thing that I see happening when people are thinking they've got something to prove is they constantly critiquing themselves and judging themselves against this standard of being good enough. I've got to prove like that I'm good enough. But the problem with being good enough or proving yourself as a goal is it's actually a really rubbish goal, because you couldn't possibly measure it. Let's say you were creating a goal or like a target for your team. You wouldn't give them something as vague as being good enough, but they'd look at you and be like, well, what do you mean? How on earth are we going to know that we're quote unquote good enough? How would we know when we have quote unquote proved ourselves? And they'd be right to be skeptical because you can't measure that. You can't ever know whether you've hit it, which for this little gremlin thought of I need to prove myself is the perfect disguise. It's like, it doesn't matter how hard you work, it doesn't matter what you do, it doesn't matter how many promotions you get, because I'm always going to be here being like, I think you need to prove yourself. You're not good enough. It's a trap. So I encourage you, be like, see this trap for what it is. Good enough for what? Another thing that I see happening when people think they have to prove themselves is they say yes when they mean, oh, please no. I have to take this on. I have to say yes to that. 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 I have to do this. I have to do this. I have to do this. What I need or what I want or my um, priorities are maybe going to go out of the window because I'm trying to prove myself. So I've got to do everything for everyone. And another thing that happens is I see people comparing themselves to other people. Well, they seem to be good enough, but I'm not. But it's always this like vague, unmeasured, random, mm, like it's the opposite of any kind of smart goal that you might set. It's just this random idea. And while this thought is living in your mind, I need to prove myself. It could be doing one or all of those things, or maybe even more that you can identify. So, what can you do about it? I think the first thing is you've got to notice that you're actually even thinking it. You've got to notice that you're believing it. And you might have heard me start in this podcast episode about having to prove yourself and think, oh, well, I know I think that. I always think that. I've always thought that. Or it might be more subtle. Like the first client that example that I mentioned, he didn't really know that he was thinking that until we looked into it a little bit. So the first thing you need to do is notice that you're thinking it or you're believing this thought that you need to prove yourself. And then once you've noticed it, once you've said, oh, yeah, okay, I am believing that, then you can start to test it out and explore it a little bit. And sometimes I find that this thought, I need to prove myself, it can be a bit like a vampire. So when you open the curtain on this belief and the sun comes in, it can just crumble to dust like that. I've seen that happen in coaching sessions many times, and then the belief just crumbles to dust. Once somebody actually turns around and looks that gremlin in the face and says, "Oh, I didn't even know you were there. No way. I don't actually need to prove myself. I am good enough at my job." Poof, gone. But it may be that for some of us, it requires a little bit more work than that. A little bit more testing out, a little bit more exploring. And I actually think that it's worth doing because think about what it would do to somebody's confidence if their boss were telling them every day, you need to prove yourself today. For me, I think it would set me up into a spiral of insecurity, doubt, hypervigilance, focusing on the negatives. Oh, I just think it would create the kinds of conditions that confidence would never thrive in. And for most people who I coach where we find this thought, it's part of a low confidence cycle for them. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about via a low confidence cycle, then go to the show notes and click the link and you can have a look at low and high confidence cycles. Basically, the low confidence cycle is when you're not feeling as confident as you want, there's usually a set of habits and patterns which are present. And for most of my clients who I've coached on this particular issue, this thinking, I need to prove myself, is part of self-doubt, which is part of the low confidence cycle. And I'll sometimes ask, can you feel as confident as you want and still be believing I need to prove myself? And most people say no. So we'll explore. So is it true? Because let's say we've just been thinking that thought, we haven't really examined it before. You can examine it a little bit and just test it out. Well, is it actually true that you need to prove yourself? What is it exactly that you need to prove? How will you know when you have proved yourself? Does it end? Is there a milestone or uh, an end point? If not, will you be endlessly trying to prove yourself? And what is it that you have to prove? And even if it's like, well, I need to prove that I'm good enough at my job. Well, what does good enough mean? And ask a load of questions. Really, really, really test it out. Because most of the time for these thoughts, they're not mm, they haven't got a strong, what's a good way of saying this? I'm kind of thinking back to my legal days. So if this thought were up on trial, they haven't normally got much of an evidence base. They're just sort of an abstract thought that's living there, but it doesn't have a lot of specifics. It doesn't stand up to much scrutiny and it will not bear much analysis most of the time. So once you can really start to look at it and examine it, turn it over, and just see what that thought is really all about, you might be able to see that actually it doesn't have any real basis. And if you keep believing that thought, you're going to be thinking it forever because it doesn't matter what you do. If the thought's still there, it's never going to be good enough. So here's an example, and this is another client example. Where we were looking at, well, what exactly is it that you are trying to prove? And they said, well, I'm trying to prove that they were right to appoint me to the role. So we had a chat about that, and I said, well, can you just believe that now? And they said, well, I suppose so. Obviously, the people who appointed me to the role thought that they were right to appoint me to the role, otherwise, they wouldn't have done. So we also looked at, like, what's the evidence? What's the evidence that they were right to appoint you to the role? What's the evidence that actually you're the best person for that role? And they could actually give me quite a lot of evidence. And they concluded that actually they were the best person for the role for quite a few reasons. And isn't that interesting? So that thought that they needed to prove that the people who appointed them were right to appoint them to the role was living in their brain at the same time as all of those bits of evidence that no, they really were the best person for the role, and here was why. But the bit that was winning, the bit that was creating the problem and the drama was, I need to prove that they were right to appoint me to the role. So I hope this has been helpful. I don't know whether you're someone who experiences this thought or might be experiencing this thought that I need to prove myself. And I hope this episode has given you some ideas about how you could explore it, how you could think about it, how you could test it out. So if you want to do that work with me, you can do private confidence coaching. And typically, I work with clients for a 3-month period. And we look at your very specific confidence challenges. And then we look at what are the beliefs and the thoughts and the things that are happening in your brain which are creating this low confidence problem? And how can we change them? So there's a link in the show notes if you want to do some private coaching with me, or if you want to explore it, you can book a call and we can explore it together. And the next way that you can work with me is, and you can work with me at 3 a.m. via the magic of recorded videos on the internet, is the Confident at Work digital course. That's a self-paced study course where you can learn all the foundational habits and behaviors that create low confidence and how to fix them. So you can go from a low confidence cycle into a high confidence cycle, and you have lifetime access to that course. Plus, if you work with me privately as a one-on-one coaching client, you'll just get that thrown in for free. So, wishing you a confident week. And if you're thinking, I need to prove myself, wishing you well with exploring that and really putting that up to some scrutiny. Because my experience is that that thought might be getting in your way, causing you problems, and eroding your confidence. And we don't want that now, do we? All right. I'll see you in next week's episode.